The wind swept across the wide Montana plains, carrying with it the smell of dust, sage, and the faint promise of rain. James Callahan sat on the porch of his ranch house, boots propped against the worn railing, his hat tilted low to shade his eyes from the lowering sun. It had been another long day, mending fences, tending to cattle, and fighting the silence that pressed against him as the nights grew longer. He was 40, strong of build, but his face bore the lines of solitude. His neighbors, few and far between, had wives and children to fill their homes with laughter. James had only his horses, the creak of his saddle, and the lonely whistle of the prairie wind. That evening, as he chewed a piece of jerky and stared across the land he had worked half his life to claim, he noticed a wagon rattling along the dirt track toward his place. It wobbled like a drunk man's step, drawn by a tired mule. When the wagon pulled up, James recognized the driver, Hank Morley, a man from town known for two things: drinking and gambling away whatever he could scrounge. Hank's clothes were filthy, his eyes bloodshot, and in the back of the wagon sat a girl. She looked no older than 18, her hair tangled, her face pale, her dress worn thin. She sat very still, her eyes lowered, hands clasped in her lap. "Evenin', Callahan," Hank slurred, sliding off the wagon bench. He staggered forward, stinking of whiskey. "I come to make you an offer." James didn't like the sound of that. He straightened in his chair, his hand resting on his belt buckle. "What kind of offer?" Hank jerked a thumb toward the girl. "My daughter, Elsie. She's deaf, been that way since birth. Ain't no good to me. Can't cook proper, can't hear instructions, can't talk back neither. Just another mouth I can't feed." James felt a twist in his gut. He looked at the girl again. She sat motionless, eyes cast downward, like she wasn't really present at all. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "You're drunk," James said flatly. "Maybe so," Hank sneered, "but I'm serious. You're out here alone, got yourself a big house. You need someone to keep it clean, cook your meals. She ain't much, but she'll do. I'll sell her to you cheap. $50. James froze, anger sparking in his chest. "She ain't cattle to be sold." Hank shrugged. "Maybe not, but what other choice she got? Stay with me. She'll starve. Least with you she'll eat. And you, well, you won't be so lonely no more." The girl finally lifted her eyes, just for a second, meeting James's gaze. They were large, a soft shade of gray, and filled with something he couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, but also hope, fragile as a bird in the hand. James sighed, dragging a hand down his face. Every bone in his body told him it was wrong, but he also knew what would happen if he sent her back with Hank. He'd seen too many women broken by men like him. "You'll take the money and never come back for her," James said sternly. Hank's grin widened, showing yellow teeth. "Done." James fetched the money from inside the house, slapping the bills into Hank's dirty hand. The drunkard pocketed it and clambered back into his wagon without a backward glance at his daughter. "She's yours now," he said, and drove off into the dimming horizon. The girl remained where she was, sitting on the wagon bench, her small figure hunched as though braced for a blow. James stepped closer, softening his tone. "Come on, miss. Let's get you inside." She hesitated, then slid down from the wagon. She was barefoot, her toes dusty. Up close, James could see she was thinner than she should have been, her cheeks hollowed, her dress hanging loose from her shoulders. He led her into the ranch house, a modest but sturdy home with polished wood floors and a stone fireplace still warm from the fire he'd stoked earlier. "You can sleep in the spare room," he said, pointing down the hallway. I'll find you some proper clothes tomorrow." She gave no response, only lowered her head and slipped quietly into the room. That night, James lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. The image of her gray eyes haunted him. What kind of father sold his own daughter? And what kind of man did it make him, buying her, even if it was to keep her safe? The next morning, James rose early, as always. He cooked bacon and eggs, the sizzle of grease filling the kitchen. When the girl appeared, she moved like a shadow, silent, her steps light as though afraid to disturb him. "Sit," James said gently, setting a plate on the table. She obeyed, folding her hands before eating, waiting as though for permission. James nodded. "Go on." She ate with a hunger that told him she hadn't seen a meal like that in weeks. For the first time, a faint flush of color touched her cheeks. Throughout the day, she followed him with quiet obedience. She washed dishes, swept the floor, and tried to tidy his cluttered living room. She never spoke, never gestured, never even hummed a sound. Truly deaf, James thought. Poor girl. But that evening, as he carried water in from the well, he noticed something odd. The bucket slipped from his grip and clanged against the stone step. The noise was sharp, startling even him. And for just a fraction of a second, Elsie flinched. James froze, eyes narrowing. Had she reacted to the sound? Or was it just coincidence? He said nothing, only watched her quietly as she bent to pick up the broom. The girl's face was unreadable, her gray eyes fixed on the floor. But James knew what he saw. Something about Elsie wasn't what it seemed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though it was unlike anything James had known before. Elsie moved through the ranch house like a soft wind, almost invisible but always present. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, folded his clothes with neat care, and even learned how to tend the fire so that the hearth never went cold. James had expected awkwardness, maybe even rebellion, but instead she carried herself with quiet diligence. Sometimes, when he glanced her way, he caught her eyes lingering on him, curious and cautious, as though measuring whether he was a man she could trust. Still, the thought gnawed at him, that slight flinch when the bucket had hit the stone. He couldn't shake it. One morning, as he saddled his horse, he decided to test her. He cleared his throat deliberately and said, "I'll be gone down to the east pasture for a spell. You keep yourself safe here." He spoke while standing behind her, his voice low but clear. To his astonishment, her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly, as though she'd heard him. Slowly she turned her head, eyes lowered, then busied herself sweeping again. James's heart thumped. He was sure of it now, she could hear. But why pretend otherwise? That evening, when he came back from the fields, he found her sitting by the window, mending one of his shirts. The last rays of sunlight spilled across her hair, softening her thin features. He hesitated, then walked closer. "You're not deaf, are you?" he asked quietly. The needle froze in her hand. She didn't lift her head, but her lips pressed together, trembling. "I saw you flinch," James continued, crouching so he was level with her, "when the bucket fell. And this morning, when I spoke, you heard me." For a long time, she didn't move. Then, slowly, tears welled in her eyes. Her hands shook, and the shirt slipped into her lap. "Please," she whispered hoarsely, the first sound she'd ever made in his presence. Her voice was soft, strained, as though unused for years. "Don't send me back." James felt his chest tighten. "Back? To your father? Never." She raised her eyes then, and he saw the storm inside them. Fear, shame, and something deeper, a plea for safety. He said no one would want me if they thought I was whole. That I'd only be worth something if I kept quiet, if I acted broken. If I was deaf, I was easier to control. Her words came haltingly, as though dragged from a place of deep pain. James's hands curled into fists at his sides. The thought of Hank using his own daughter's silence as a prison made his stomach churn. "You're safe here," James said firmly. "I don't care if you can hear, can't hear, or never speak again. You'll never go back to him." A sob escaped her, and for the first time, she let herself cry openly. James, unsure at first, gently placed a hand on her shoulder. When she didn't pull away, he drew her into a careful embrace. She was so light it felt as though she might break, but she clung to him like a child who had been waiting years for someone to hold her. From that night onward, things changed. Elsie no longer pretended. She began to speak more, though her voice was soft and hesitant, as if afraid the air itself might punish her for using it. She asked questions, about the ranch, about the horses, about the endless expanse of land stretching beyond the horizon. James answered patiently, his voice warm, steady, never raising in anger. He showed her how to ride a horse, steadying her in the saddle as she laughed breathlessly, hair flying in the wind. He taught her how to milk the cow, how to gather eggs from the chicken coop without being pecked. In return, she surprised him with little kindnesses, a neatly mended shirt, fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table, bread baked with her own tentative hands. At night, when the house was quiet and the crickets sang outside, James would sit by the fire and watch her sew or hum softly under her breath. The loneliness that had once hung over him like a storm cloud began to lift. Yet he could not ignore the truth. He had bought her, even if to save her. It weighed heavily on him. One evening, as the fire cracked in the hearth, he finally spoke what had long pressed on his heart. "Elsie," he said, his voice rough, "I need to make something clear. When your father came here that night, I gave him money. But I didn't buy you. No man can own you. You're free, do you understand? If you want to leave, you can. I'll help you. I won't keep you here against your will." Her gray eyes searched his face. Slowly, she set aside her sewing and moved closer. "If I leave," she whispered, "where would I go? Who would want me?" "I would," James said before he could stop himself. His voice shook with honesty. "I don't want you because of what I paid. I want you because you make this house feel alive again. Because you make me feel alive again." Her breath caught. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of firewood. Then, with trembling hands, Elsie reached out and touched his rough, calloused fingers. "I thought I'd never be safe," she said softly. "But with you, I can hear everything. Not just with my ears. With my heart." James swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the weight of her trust. He turned his hand and gently held hers, pressing it to his chest where his heartbeat thudded strong and steady. In that moment, neither of them was lonely any more. The days rolled forward, marked by the steady rhythm of work and the slow blossoming of affection. What had begun in silence grew into companionship, and what began as rescue grew into love. The lonely rancher who once ate alone now shared his table. The girl who once lived in silence now filled the house with laughter. And though the world outside might never understand how they had come together, James and Elsie both knew the truth. Sometimes, the heart hears what the world refuses to see.